I'm, of course, delighted to be here this morning, obviously, in the context of the report, because I think it's what we're attempting to do is to try to shine a light and said there is a role for the federal government to play in regard to the challenges that we have seen has been reported in the media across the country. And we do believe, of course, the federal government have an important role to play. As Senator Umar have said earlier in her remarks, that this program represents $22 billion in terms of real contribution to the Canadian economy. And if it's such an important part of the Canadian economy, the question that begs, why don't we have critical standards right across the country to ensure that these students who come to our country can experience, of course, learning in a way that will protect them? We know, of course, the abuse that they're faced with, and we know the finger pointing that is now happening as a result of housing shortages across the country. I think we have to get beyond that. The federal government do have an important responsibility in its role, because it is the federal government that issued the visa to anybody that wants to come to this country. Our embassies have a critical role in what they do. And some of the things that we believe are critical to the federal government to play is how the government can immediately strengthen the measures that these students can come here and not experience what we have seen reported in the media. Most often, people who come to this country don't know the fundamental way we govern our country. We have rights in this country. We have rights no matter where you may choose to come. Students who come to participate in the program don't come to a province. They come to a place called Canada. That's what they know when they decide they're going to embark on this journey. And we need to protect the brand that Canada is famous for and represents around the world. And what we're seeing in regard to the abuse is this is not going to reflect very well on a province or a particular institution, reflect on the country as a whole. And I think we have to do something in that regard. So the federal government can use its levers through its visa process, that issuing a visa, to allow students to know that they have rights. For instance, employment standard rights if they're going to work in a particular province. They know they have rights from discrimination in a particular province. The Human Rights Code protects all of us as they do in every jurisdiction. The embassy can, of course, alert students regarding whichever province they're going to, what are those rights in their particular jurisdiction. Of course, standards are critical to the integrity of the program. If we don't have standards of how recruiters are going to recruit students, there will continue to be abuse. And when private actors engage in abuse, they should lose their ability to access the visa process that further enriches them. It should not be allowed to continue. Public institutions have a higher standard, we know that, and of course, to a large extent, I think there's a recognition that if they don't abide by their own standards on their own, but I think leaving it to themselves is not good enough. The federal government can bring the province and the territory together to ensure they're doing the right thing. And of course, ensuring the students have proper. I'll conclude, I think, in this regard to say that what we have been seeing reported in the media, if it's allowed to continue, will be a really, I think, a detriment to this program. And for the families who, in many cases, sometimes sell their entire possession to send their loved ones to Canada, this is not a way for us to treat those individuals coming to our country. As a former immigrant myself who came to this country, I recognize fundamentally my own picture in what I see some of these students experience in this country. I think we can do better. We must do better. Over 50% of the international students come to Ontario. The next largest jurisdiction is BC, and the third jurisdiction is Quebec. These three jurisdictions alone represent almost 75% of the total students who come to this country. Certainly the federal government can convene a meeting to say, hey, listen, we're going to act, and we're going to act in a very decisive way. We recognize provincial and territorial government do have responsibility for education, but the federal government have some responsibility to protect the brand of Canada and to ensure abuse will not continue to happen, and put some standards in place will make sure that doesn't happen. So thank you so much.
Press. When you talk about abuse, what exactly did you mean by that?
Well, there's a variety of abuse have been reported in the media, from sexual abuse of students, people exploiting them because they believe they're vulnerable in the context as, they're here in the visa system. There's workplace abuse in the context of working for employers and, of course, not knowing what their rights are and how they can protect those rights in the context of employment. And, of course, the other abuse, which we've been seeing more and more, of course, are the housing challenges people living in conditions that are simply not acceptable. And of course, those who are landlords and are renting to these young students in our country, what would they do about it? Who do they complain to about that? And I think these are basic things in a democratic society we should govern, and it should not be less for an international student than it is for Canadians in general. But the reality is, when you're dependent on a visa to remain in this country, you're very vulnerable. And recognizing these are very young people, and sometimes necessarily not knowing what their rights are, the state has an important role to play, both at the provincial level, the municipal level, and the national level. And we need to ensure adherence to a set of values that represent this country, and more importantly, represent the fact and how we made it possible for these students to come here. They came to Canada with an understanding they would be treated fairly and be given an opportunity to get a decent education. So I think it's critical that the government recognize this will only get worse, especially when there's a proliferation on private education system that are growing in the country. These are not about the public institutions, but the private system that doesn't adhere to common standards that we can say this will represent what Canada is trying to promote internationally.
I'm just asking a question because I work for the French media, and we were looking about francophones coming from other countries to study. Was that taken in consideration in the report?
Yes, the report, if you look at it, there is a breakdown of the source countries, and I think it will give you a listing, and some of those source countries are francophone countries in which students are coming from.
But is there a way to help the universities that welcome those francophone countries? Yeah.
I think, again, universities that are tracking francophone students have a responsibility to ensure they can communicate them in their own language, French in that case, but also provide, as most jurisdictions can, an understanding what their basic rights within those province and territory which they're going to reside in and get their education.